Okay, well, good morning. Thank you, Elena and Karin, for the invitation. In my case, it didn't come necessarily as a surprise because I have done some work on Africa and on African women, although originally I was trained as an early modernist. But because I work on labor, over the years I have engaged with labor in Africa and moved from the early modern period or pre-colonial Africa into the modern period. So what I think and what I propose to Elena to do today is basically talk about two methodologies that I have used in the past in two projects that I was engaged with, not specifically to look at women's work in the urban setting, but to look at occupational, so changes in men and women's participation in the economy, in the different sectors, but also on the capacities in which they engage in the economy, so in terms of their labor relations. So for the talk today, what I would like to do is, talk a bit about the sources that I have used and that can be used for the study of women's occupation and see how you can extract urban occupations from that. And then I will talk specifically about these two methodologies. One that is more oriented to classify and analyze women's participation in the occupational structures of the country, so in which economic sectors or sub-economic groups they participate. And then another methodology that I've used to classify women's labor relations, so in which capacities do women engage in labor and what is their relationship with their employer or the absence of an employer. So these two methodologies are the PST or the PSTI or the PEST. They have different denominations. That is a system of classification of occupations that has been developed by the Cambridge Group, and Felix just referred to it. And then the other methodology is the taxonomy of labor relations, which was developed at the International Institute of Social History, where I'm based, that aims, in fact, to track changes in the labor relations, both of men and women, over time. So that's what I will be focusing on today. So what I will present today stems basically from two projects. One is the Global Collaboratory on the History of Labor Relations that is based at my home institution, that basically tracks changes in how men and women participate in the economy over time in an attempt to see when there is a transition to wage labor and self-employment. And that covers a period of 1500 to 2000. We don't have information for all the countries for all this vast period, but we have for Africa, especially for the 19th and 20th century. Karin, for example, has collaborated with the Collaboratory with data on Tanzania, and I have done a case study on Mozambique, and I will present some results here today from that. But the idea is to look at changes over time, changes over regions, and then if you are looking at the specific country, then changes within the country among both men and women. Then later on, I also the Cambridge Group, together with Garrett Austin, launched another project that aimed at studying the changes in the occupational structure of African countries over the last 200 years that became known by the acronym of AFSHOS. And basically the idea was to reconstruct the occupational structure of these countries, so how it changed, and if they follow a similar or a different pattern from other parts of the world. And several of us, I think Felix, you are also involved in the occupational structures, and Karin as well. We were invited to work on different countries in different case studies. In my case, again, I worked on Mozambique, and I will present some of these results here today after first explaining the methodologies that we used. In both cases, The methodology is applied on the basis of a database that is constructed, and is a database that is constructed for different benchmark years. So you have here the benchmark years, and then if you have data for the whole of the country, you construct a database or with that data. If you don't, you can pick up representative regions and use them as samples for what you are doing. And one of the variables in both of these projects that we paid attention was gender. So the gender dimension was something that we really wanted to record. So what kind of sources do we use for this? So usually in both cases, we use censuses, and ideally you depart from the national censuses. But there are cases, especially for African countries, where the first census that you have available are not at the national level, but are at the city level or at the provincial level. Here you have an example. This is the first kind of modern census that is done in Mozambique. And this is for what was the former capital, Lourenço Marques, nowadays Maputo, and that dates from 1912. So that's relatively early in terms of modern census. But then what we also do is, because the census data is very problematic in a way, we combine the evidence that we gather from the census with other census materials, and also, whenever is available, ethnographic information. And what I've used in the case of Mozambique, I used agricultural census, but I also used surveys, especially for the period after independence, where there were decades that there were no census available. There are a series of surveys that are carried out by NGOs and international organizations on the labor market and on the informal sector. So I've used also those in order to complement or to fill the gaps that you have in the census. So that's the type of sources that have been using. Here you have one of those examples. This is written in Portuguese, in fact, but is an inquiry into the informal sector in Mozambique in the year of 2004. So what kind of data you can get out of this census? I mean, of course, you get total population, but you can get it at not only at the country level, at least in the case of the Portuguese census, even from the very early period, you can also get data at the municipality level and at the city level. And I think that is something that would be interesting for this project, if you can get information at the city level. I think in this respect, maybe the Portuguese census are a little bit more detailed when it comes to information on women than the British census, especially the earlier ones, because there's very little information on women's occupation in the British census. You can also get, then the total population on male and female, but you get other types of vital information like age groups, marital status, religion, what we would, I put it under quotation marks, ethnic groups, because that's the classification, the colonial classification of the different population groups. And then you have information on occupations, which is, I think, the most relevant for here. And I brought you here an example. This is again from the font is very small, but I will talk you through what is in here. This is again from that same census of the 1912. And here you have the information. So this is population coming of Portuguese origin, and the Africans were also classified as being of Portuguese origin. And these are women that you have here. And on this side you have the occupations. And what you're going to see here is that the majority of these women will be classified as having an undefined or insufficiently detailed occupation. That's a very common reference in the census. The other larger group will be classified as housewives, and that is the problem of that we were just discussing with Felix's paper, which often they are not housewives, but they declare themselves as housewives. But then there's other professions that will appear already in the census of the 1912s, like dressmaker or a seamstress, washwomen, cooks, and this one maybe I can see better. And then there's the category of contracted workers, serviçais, which is a very large category. In fact, that's the majority of the women. And these were forcefully contracted workers in the Portuguese, so it's like the engagé in the French context. And they are going to, and here of course they appear only under one category, but these women can perform a variety of tasks. So you would have to look into other types of documentation, especially documentation from plantations, from factories, from agricultural complexes that existed in Mozambique at that time in the region around what is today Maputo, and look at specific occupations that they did within those places where they work, because this is the general designation that is given in the census. But at the same time, this gives you an idea of the kind of occupations that appear for this specific city, and of course you will also have people from other origins, but they are less significant. But these are not white women, these are African women, because you have here also the division between whites, yellow, and forgive me the terminology, but that's literally what is in the census, and then mixed descent people and black people. So they clearly, there's a clear division. And of course you also have females, but the females are, the white females are a significant number. So the census have problems, as you can see from here. So there's a overly excessive number of women classified as housewives. There's an excessive number of women classified as having an undefined occupation. And the other problem is that there is this category of serviçais, so engagé, that you don't really know from the census what is their specific occupation. So over time, you will have more information, more detail, but often you have to combine these sources with other types of sources if you want to do a very specific study on the occupation of women. Should I admit? No? Okay. So here again you have another example. So that was from the inner city. This is from the outskirts of the city, because the census divides what is the core of the city and the outskirts. And again, you have the same type of professions appearing also in the outskirts, being this category of engagé one of the main categories. So this is just to give you I brought the census to give you an example of the source material that I work with, and then now I would start talking a bit of the methodologies that I have applied to the census. So one of the first methodology was the PSTI, so it stands for primary, secondary, tertiary, or primary, secondary, tertiary, international, because this originally was designed to be applied for the British case. But there were categories for the British case that were not fitted when they started to do comparison with other countries. So they created the PSTI, which is a system that has more categories, so that economic activities, for example, that appear in Japan or in China could be represented in the system, and later on, specifically in the case of Africa, because the extractive sector was so important in certain countries, they changed the acronym to PEST, so it's primary, extractive, secondary, and tertiary. So the extractive sector was separated so that it would become more visible. So that's what the acronym stands for. So basically what this system does is it collects the occupations that are available in the census, and then you classify with a code number those occupations. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's a whole list, and it's available on the website. I will not go in detail through the list because it's multiple pages. But what is important to retain is that you have 3 levels of classification. So you classify the occupations at the level of economic sector, and then at the level of economic group, so within each sector, which economic groups, and then which economic subgroups. So an example, so someone can work in the primary sector, in husbandry, and then within husbandry you can be specialized in, for example, growing cows, for example. And you have the same for the secondary and for the tertiary sector. Sometimes the census do not provide information detailed enough to classify in all these levels, so you classify as far as you can, and you will see in the data I will present that is not always possible to classify at the 3 different levels. So basically, this is the way the process of classification is done, and there are problems with this system as well, because there's occupations that are very difficult to classify within these 3 economic sectors, and there are also a lot of people that will declare themselves as housewives or students, but they have a secondary occupation that they are also not accounted for here. So, the by-employment and the multiple employment is something that is a problem, because you need to choose one key occupation to do the classification. So I will show you now some results applying this method to the Mozambique case as using census. So the national census starting in the 1930s and going until 2007. So this is for the total of the country, so the whole territory of Mozambique. And you can see here the evolution over time. And you see that the primary sector clearly dominates, and the extractive sector here is overrepresented because the first census is not as reliable as the following ones. But from the here on, you see a clear trend. So there's a gradual growth on the secondary sector over time, also a bit a growth on the extractive sector, but very modest, and then the tertiary sector as well. But the primary sector dominates over the whole period. I will not go in a lot of detail into these graphs because I think you're most interested on the gender dimension, but I thought it would be interesting to see how this can be applied. So here you have the same, so the whole territory, the primary sector divided per economic groups, and again you see most people are in agriculture, and only a limited number of people will be in the fishing sector, although that grows at a given during the late colonial period, but then declines again after independence. And then on this one you have the extractive and the secondary sectors together, and here again you see in blue, so it's industry, so there is a growth of industry, but then later on you'll have a decline. But I think what's most interesting for you is this is the tertiary sector. So again, you can see here these in green is traders, so it's basically trade. In blue is the services, which is in fact the bulk of it is domestic service. And then in yellow you have the transport. And this is the evolution over time. So I think this is the regional variation. So that's something that you can also do. I did it per province in Mozambique, but you can do it at the city level if you have information for that. And these census provide information for that. It was not my goal to do it for Maputo and for Kliman and other key cities, so I did it at the national level, but you can do it at the city level. And specifically for women or for men and women if you want to do that. And here you can see, I think, important differences. Of course, this is the province where Lourenço Marques and Maputo is, which is named Maputo province nowadays, and you see a very different pattern in terms of occupational structures and changes over time if you compare with regions more further north, which are more agricultural, like Nampula or Cabo Delgado, for example. So this is more on the regional variations, but so this is more detailed now with the main economic groups. And here you can see, especially in Maputo, there's a significant variation. So agriculture declines significantly, and you see an increase on the industry, on construction and public works, but also on trade and on domestic service, which is here represented with this brownish color. That's what I was mentioning to you earlier. But I think this is probably what is most interesting for you, is that this methodology allows also to look at the variations in gender participation in the different economic sectors. And here you see this is men. For some reason the label man disappeared, but so this is men and this is women. And it's even though men are mainly employed in the primary sector, it's quite striking the difference when it comes to the secondary and the tertiary sector. That you see in the case of women. So they are very underrepresented in these sectors. Of course, I think this again is a problem that is related on the way the census is done. On one hand, how the census takers register the information and how people self-identified, which was something that was mentioned by someone earlier. So a lot of these women are going to identify as housewives, for example, so they will not be classified in any of the economic sectors. Nevertheless, they will perform an economic activity besides being a housewife. And that is very difficult to capture in using the census data, which was what I was using for the purpose of this specific project. So often you have to look into secondary literature, other types of sources, to be able to say something meaningful about what were women doing in this period, because if you look at the percentages, the change is very, very minimal in the overall population. But if you look at the province, like for example Maputo, you will see a significant difference in the participation of women because it's the capital city. So here, of course, there's also that issue. This is a more detailed, so this is at the level of economic group. And here you can see a little bit more, the tendency is the same, but you have a bit more detail. So you can see that there's an increase in the case of women engaged in commerce over time, so dealers and sellers. But there's also an increase in the participation of women in industry, but it's very modest if you take the overall female population of the country and you compare that with what you see in the case of men. Of course, the fact that there's a lot of migration to South Africa in the case of Mozambique, but also to the north, plays a role on these statistics. So this was one of the projects and one of the methodologies. If you have questions more detailed, then I can, in the Q&A explain more. But I thought that I would just keep it brief so that it's not also too many crafts for people. Then the other project that I was busy with is more oriented towards labor and the classification of labor and the capacities in which you participate in the labor market. And that project was the Global Collaboratory on the History of Labor Relations. You have here just the web page. And the overall goal of this project is to trace changes in the ways people engage with labor and in what context they work. So basically they define, for the purpose of the project, they define labor as any human effort adding use value to goods and services. So that is the definition, which is a rather broad definition. And why the definition is this broad was because one of the ambitions of this project was to account for the work that is performed within the household, the work that is performed for a polity but is not paid for, and then the work that is performed for the market, where you could do that in different capacities. So before I go into the methodology, I will show you first this, and I will talk you through. It's not very visible what it is. But basically what we do is we also depart from the total population of the country. So we use also census data. And then what we try to do is we try to classify that population in 4 main groups. So those that don't work or cannot work, those that do reciprocal labor, and reciprocal labor is labor that you are not paid for. So it's something that you do in return for something that is done for you. So that work is usually mainly in the context of the household. And then you have tributary labor, so labor that you do usually for the polity, out of obligation, but you are not paid for. And then you have what we call commodified labor, so labor that you do for the market economy on one hand, but also labor that you do for the public sector. Which we separate from the market economy. So we, in this taxonomy, is divided separately. So those that cannot work, you have basically people that cannot work because they are underage, they cannot work because they are incapacitated in some way, or because they are extremely wealthy and they don't need to work. When it comes to the household, and I think this is one of the most innovative elements in this taxonomy and this project, we look basically at 5 main categories. So those that are the head of the household, and they are the leading producers within the household, can be women, men, can be the man or the woman, depending on who heads the household and the activities that are being carried out there, but also those that are keen within the household and work without pay within that household and contribute to the household economy, being within what is retained within the household, but also what the household produces that ends up in the market. So both dimensions. And then we also included in here those that are not keen, but they are included within the household and also contribute to the household with reciprocal labor, as well as servants, and the servants can also be, for example, enslaved. They will also be included as well. In those, in some communities, you have also what they call redistributed labor, so people that are within the household but they co-work for the community, but it's not really a polity, so we also classify them as working for the households, in the sense that they, work for the whole of the community. For example, in communities where you have women that perform care for children of multiple households, but they are not paid, so they would be classified in this category of redistributed labors. So people that work for multiple households, but they are not paid for. And that's very common in women that do care work, for example. Then for the polity, what we classified as tributary labor for the polity is basically obligatory work, indentured work that you do without pay, tributary labor that you do, and that's very common in Africa. So you could do it as a slave, but you could also do it as a serf in other contexts. So in Russia, for example, you will have that. When it comes to the commodified labor, as I said, we have divided what is commodified labor for the market. So people that have the ability to sell their labor to the market, and you can sell your labor to the market in multiple capacities. You can be self-employed, you can be an employer, you can be a wage earner, you can also be but you can also be, for example, a slave. And at the same time, you will also be selling your master will sell your labor capacity and your labor output to the market, because the masters could, and well, in some places they still do, rent the labor of enslaved people to other people, or they sell the output of the work of enslaved people to the market. So, which means that despite the fact that you are in a coerced situation, you will also be the output of your labor, and your labor will be involuntarily sold to the market economy. And that's why we also included these in as being people that have their labor being sold to the market, regardless of not being them selling themselves the labor to the market. Originally, this was not included in the taxonomy, but on the moment that the researchers started to work on Latin America, they started to work on Africa and other parts of Asia, this was a problem that popped up, and these categories had to be added. And then finally, within what is commodified labor, we also have people that work for non-market organizations, and these are, for example, the NGOs, but also the public sector, which is not market-oriented. Although during the colonial period, for example, in Africa, this is problematic because you will have the state owning companies that produce for the market. So here again, there are issues when it comes to the taxonomy, but this is a work in progress. So this is not the first version, this is the current version. The taxonomy has changed over time, usually to add more categories that we can better capture the different capacities in which women and men appear engaged with labor. So what I will do now is I will try to show you and talk you through how I applied. Maybe I will go back because I think this is very important. So this is just 2 slides on the methodology so that you can understand the process by which I got to this. So for example, this is from the case of Mozambique that I will present later. So for the benchmark of 1800, there are no census, so no modern census. So what I had to do is, based on the population counts we have for the different cities that were controlled by the Portuguese and secondary literature, I had to estimate what would be the total population of the region that was controlled by the Portuguese. Then I had to estimate the inactive population and the active population. On the basis of that, then you can divide them per economic activity or economic sector, and I use the same economic sectors as in the previous project. And once you have people as occupations, you can also attribute labor relations to them. So then you can say, if someone works for the state, you will be a wage earner for a non-market organization. If you are a wage earner because you work in a factory, then you would be a wage earner for the market. That's how the classification is done. And once you have done that for the whole of the population, then you can have a final graph for the whole of the country. Do I need to do something? No? Okay. So, and this is the same methodology that I use, but then for the benchmarks of 1900, 1950, and 2000. So you use the census data. So you calculate total population, you calculate inactive and active population. This often is not what is in the census, because they would classify, for example, children, even though they are working, as non-active, so as non-working. But we have moved those children that work to the active population, so we have a more coherent image of what was going on, and then the rest of the process is basically the same. So these are kind of the key steps in applying the methodology starting from census data. This we have to already talk through. And now I will show you some of the results of this. So this covers the whole period. So this initial period is based on estimates because there are no census. This 1912 is basically based on only the Maputo census, because we don't have another census for other cities. But from here on, you have data at the national level. And the colors are not the best, but I will talk you through it. The majority of the population is classified as non-working, so because there's a significant number of children. Let me see if this. Yeah, correct. So you can. So that's the first category here. And this should be gray, but you don't see it as gray. So, and that category of gray is reciprocal labor. So people that work without pay for the household, and you can see in the 1940s, but also in the 1930s, that is quite significant. But over time, you see a decline on the people working for the household, while at the same time you see an increase in the number of people that work in commodified labor, being commodified labor for the market or commodified labor for the public sector. And here you have on this side, because we were in this project very much interested in understanding what happens in how does this transition from reciprocal and tributary labor to the commodified labor happen. So we always do a breakdown of how do people engage with the market economy. And here you have a representation of that. So if you can sell your labor to the market, how do you do that? And here you can see that there's a significant number of people that are self-employed. Initially in the colonial period you don't have that, but over time, especially towards the end of the colonial period, you will have a significant number of people that are self-employed. We think that this is not a real increase in self-employment. It's not that people have suddenly become entrepreneurs. I think this is above all a sign of precarization of labor in the region, that you will see this increase. So people stopped being classified as contracted workers or temporary contracted workers in the census, and they will start being classified as self-employed, but in reality they were temporary workers that were contracted by companies, but they didn't have a labor contract, so they work for a short period of time. So in the census they will appear classified as self-employed, but in reality when you read the reports you can see the type of sources, you see that that was not the case. But at the same time you also see here an increase of wage earner for the market. So people that really work for a wage, so a permanent, they have a kind of a more permanent contract, and they work for the market. And this, what I was mentioning earlier, this transition to self-employment, it's very evident here, because in the census of 1950 you have a significant number of people that are wage earners for the market, and they work for a time rate or a piece rate, and they basically in the following census they just disappear. But you see this increase then in self-employment. So, and when you read the other type of reports, then you see that what is happening is that there's a reclassification in the census, and they will appear as entrepreneurs, but in fact they are not entrepreneurs. They are people that are renting their labor on a temporary basis to multiple employers, and they are in a precarious situation. So that's what you see. But overall, you do see that there's an increase in the number of people that are engaged with the labor market, and they have the capacity to sell their labor, being more or less free, of course, because the freedom of choice to sell their labor is in some cases limited. And this graphs gives you a comparison between, men and women, which I think is the most interesting for you. And here you see reciprocal labor. I only brought two types. I didn't do the tributary labor because in the census it's very difficult to capture the tributary labor because the colonial authorities wanted to hide forced labor. So you need to use other types of sources to track the forced labor. So I brought you here just the reciprocal labor and the commodified labor, and you can see that, especially in the reciprocal labor, the difference is staggering. There's a higher number of women in reciprocal labor than men, and this doesn't change significantly over time. The only census where you have less women in reciprocal labor in the 1960s, and I don't have an explanation for that. I think this has something to do with how they did the census. But there is a trend of decline, and which is different in the 1997, and I think this has to do with the civil war in Mozambique and significant high rates of migration. But in any case, what I think is important to retain is that there's a significant higher number of women working for the household and for the economy of the household, even if what they produce within the household is also for the market, than you have in terms of men. And when it comes to commodified labor, again, you see that men will enter the labor market very early on in Mozambique, which is a common trend throughout colonial Africa, in fact, and this will keep growing over time, while women will enter very late, and only when you get to the 1980s and the 1990s, you see women, having a more or less equal share in terms of participation in the market as men. And this, of course, the Civil War here played a role, because the fact that a lot of men were recruited to fight left women without, another option than to enter the labor market, being in a formal way or an informal way, but they are reporting themselves as working, as having an activity that lead us to think that they are working for the market. So they are selling their labor for the market, being as strict vendors or seamstress, cooks, but there's also a lot of people, women entering the service sector and the public sector as well during this period, above all because men are significantly absent. And here you have just a more detailed graph where you have the representation of male and female and the ways in which they enter the commodified labor. So, and what we are going to see here is that most of the women are self-employed. And this is constant. I mean, it increases over time, but that is the main trend for all the census that I have looked into. And they will be in this category of, first initially they are in this category of wage workers at piece rate and time rate, and then they will be classified in the latest census as self-employed, but their working conditions remain the same. So a significant number of these women would be in a precarious working situation. You also have quite a high number of men, but the difference is quite staggering with women. Another interesting contrasting element is here when it comes to wage earners for the market, and here you see exactly the opposite. The majority of wage earners for the market, so people that have a fixed wage, are men, while you have a very limited number of women with a fixed wage, and most of them in fact are women that work for the public sector or sometimes in the transport sector there's also a few women, but the majority of the women are going to be found in fact as self-employed, performing domestic work or being engaged in commerce. And you see here what I was talking about the public sector. So this is the wage earners for non-market institutions, and here you see that of course the majority of the employees in the public sector are men, but over time there's an increase of women that also participate in the public sector, so that they become wage earners with a fixed employment. But if we compare these two figures with this, then it's quite evident that the apparently one of the few possibilities of women to sell their labor to the market in the case of Mozambique is by self-employment. So you have to sell your labor, and very often you have a very precarious situation because you are selling what you have produced, or you are selling your labor to be paid for a day work or for the amount that you can produce within a day of work. And this is basically what I brought to you, and I'm open to answer all your questions, and again thank you for inviting me.